The day I signed my divorce papers was supposed to be the worst day of my year. I had prepared myself for that. What I had not prepared for was walking into my own kitchen and hearing my brother on the phone, laughing quietly, saying, "She has no idea. Once the settlement clears, we move everything." I stood there in the hallway, my coat still on, the manila envelope from my lawyer still in my hand. My legs stopped working. My brother Daniel was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of my coffee, speaking in a voice I had never heard from him before. Calm, calculated, like he had been rehearsing. I pressed myself against the wall and listened. The account, in her name. Yes, the joint one she doesn't know I have access to. We transfer it before she thinks to freeze anything. A pause. No, she trusts me completely. She always has. That's the point. I did not walk in. I did not say his name. I turned around, walked back out the front door, sat in my car in the driveway, and tried to remember how to breathe. My name is Claire. I am 31 years old. 6 months ago, I discovered my husband, Marcus, had been having an affair with a woman he met at a conference in Denver. The affair had been going on for 2 years. 2 years of business trips that were not entirely business. 2 years of him coming home and kissing me on the cheek while I made dinner and asked about his day. When I found out, I did not scream. I did not throw things. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt something go very quiet inside me, and then I called a divorce attorney the next morning. My brother was the first person I called after that. He was the one who helped me pack boxes when I moved out of the house Marcus and I had shared in Scottsdale. He was the one who drove 4 hours from Phoenix to sit with me when I could not stop shaking. He was the one who said, "You have me. You always have me." What I had not known then and was only beginning to understand now, sitting in my car with condensation forming on the windshield, was what Daniel knew about my finances that I did not. 3 weeks before Marcus and I separated, my grandmother had passed away. Her name was Ruth. She was 84 years old, and she had built a small but fiercely profitable real estate business in Tucson over the course of 40 years. She had never spoken openly about money. She drove the same Ford pickup for 15 years. She brought her own lunch to work until she was 78. I knew she was comfortable. I did not know she was wealthy. Her attorney called me 11 days after her death. I had been in the middle of a particularly brutal conversation with Marcus about who would keep the dog. The attorney's name was Mr. Holloway, and he was very calm and very precise, and he told me that my grandmother had left me a trust worth approximately $19 million, a commercial property portfolio in 3 Arizona counties, and a personal note she had written by hand and sealed in an envelope with my name on it. I had not told Marcus. My attorney advised me not to, given that we were mid-divorce and the trust had been established years before the marriage, which meant it was protected. I had not told anyone except my brother. I told my brother everything. Now I sat in my car and I thought about the phrase, "the account in her name," that she doesn't know I have access to. I thought about 6 months ago when Daniel had helped me set up a new personal checking account after I moved out of the house, because my previous account had been a joint account with Marcus, and I wanted a clean break. Daniel had driven me to the bank. He had sat with me at the desk. He had offered to help me with the paperwork because I was barely sleeping and the grief and the divorce were sitting on me like something physical, and he said, "Let me handle the details. That's what I'm here for." I had let him handle the details. I pulled out my phone and called Nadia. She was my college roommate, now a financial attorney in Tempe, and she was the kind of person who answered the phone on the second ring at 7 in the evening without complaint. I told her what I had heard. I told her about the account. I told her about the trust. There was a silence on her end that lasted long enough that I checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Then she said, "Claire, do not go back inside. Drive to my office, right now." I drove to her office. What Nadia found over the next 3 hours was methodical and sickening. Daniel had not only been added as an authorized user on my new checking account, he had attained, through a process Nadia described as fraudulent but difficult to immediately detect, limited power of attorney documentation that had been buried in the stack of paperwork I had signed at the bank. Exhausted and trusting, the week after my marriage fell apart, the documentation had not been what it appeared to be. What I had believed was a routine bank authorization form had been something else entirely. He had also, Nadia discovered, been in contact with a financial advisor, a man named Greg who had worked briefly with my grandmother's estate before being quietly let go by Mr. Holloway for reasons that were now becoming less mysterious. Greg had access to some of the preliminary estate documents, not the full trust, but enough to understand the scope of what was coming to me. Daniel had known about the inheritance before I did. He had positioned himself before I even received the call from Mr. Holloway. He had driven me to that bank, grieving and barely functional, with a plan already in place. I sat in Nadia's office and I looked at the documents spread across her desk, and I felt a very specific kind of cold. Not the cold of grief, not the cold of shock. It was something more like clarity, the kind that arrives when the story you have been living in suddenly reveals its actual shape. "What do I do?" I said. Nadia looked at me for a moment. "You don't confront him." "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because right now, he doesn't know you know. That is the most valuable thing you have." She was right. I understood that immediately. The moment Daniel knew I had overheard that phone call, the window would close. Whatever he was planning would accelerate or go underground or both. The only advantage I had was the one I was holding right now, in this room, in the quiet. I asked Nadia what we needed to do. She told me. It was going to take time, and it was going to require me to perform, for some number of weeks, the role of a person who still trusted her brother completely. I have always been a decent actor when I had to be. My marriage to Marcus had required more performance than I had known at the time. I could do this. The next morning, I texted Daniel a photograph of a sunrise I had taken from my apartment balcony with the message, "Thinking of Grandma Ruth today." He responded with a heart emoji and said he would come by on Saturday with groceries. I said that would be wonderful. He came on Saturday. He brought oranges and sourdough bread and a bottle of wine that he knew I liked. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had heard him on the phone 4 nights earlier, and he told me that he was worried about me, and that I seemed tired, and that he wished I would take better care of myself. He held my hand across the table. He looked at me with the face I had known my entire life. I told him I was doing better. I told him having him around helped. I went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists for 30 seconds, and then I went back out and poured us both a glass of the wine he had brought. Meanwhile, Nadia was building a case. She had brought in a forensic accountant named Patrick who had worked on financial fraud cases before and who was, according to Nadia, extraordinarily thorough and extraordinarily discreet. Patrick began documenting the trail. The account, the power of attorney paperwork, Daniel's contact with Greg, a series of wire transfer attempts that had been initiated but not yet completed. The trust, thankfully, was untouched. Mr. Holloway had structured it with protections that made rapid external access nearly impossible. What Daniel had been working toward was the checking account and, through Greg, a potential challenge to the estate distribution itself. A claim that my grandmother had intended to include Daniel in the trust and had failed to update the documents before her death. It was a weak claim, legally, Nadia said, but it was the kind of thing that could delay distribution for months and create openings for other maneuvers in the meantime. I asked Nadia if we needed to involve law enforcement. She said yes, and she had already been in contact with the detective in the Financial Crimes Unit, a woman named Detective Reyes, who had reviewed the preliminary documentation and confirmed that what Patrick had found was sufficient to open a formal investigation. I asked when. "We need 3 more weeks," Nadia said. "Let Patrick finish the paper trail. The more complete it is, the cleaner the case." 3 weeks. 21 days of Saturday groceries and Sunday phone calls and texts about nothing. I learned things about myself in those 3 weeks that I had not known before. I learned that I had a capacity for stillness that surprised me. I had always thought of myself as someone who felt things loudly. I cry at commercials. I laugh too hard at things that aren't that funny. I have been told my face is unreadable to no one. But in those 3 weeks, I was very still. I did my job. I worked late. I went to the gym. I texted my brother. I answered when he called. I also, quietly and without telling anyone except Nadia, met with Mr. Holloway and restructured several aspects of the trust's administrative access to ensure that no external claim, however creatively filed, could delay my receipt of the estate. I also, with Nadia's guidance, revoked every authorization document I had ever signed at that bank and opened a new account at a different institution entirely, with a branch manager Nadia knew personally and trusted. Daniel noticed nothing. Or if he did, he said nothing. He continued to be exactly the brother I had known, attentive, warm, present. He asked about my healing from the divorce. He asked about my job. He sent me a playlist one evening with a note that said songs for when you feel like you're starting over. I listened to 3 of the songs, and then I put my phone face down on the counter and stood at the window for a long time. On a Thursday evening in the 4th week, Nadia called and said, "Patrick is done. Detective Reyes is ready. We can move Friday." I asked what that meant in practical terms. "It means Daniel will be contacted by the detective and asked to come in for a conversation. The power of attorney document is fraudulent. That's forgery. The wire transfer attempts are documented. Greg has already been interviewed and has been cooperative." She paused. "Claire, he is going to lose his financial license. He will very likely face criminal charges." I sat down on the floor. I am not sure why the floor. It just seemed like the right place to be at that moment. "He did this while you were grieving," Nadia said, more quietly. "He planned it before you even knew what you had inherited. That is not a moment of weakness. That is a decision he made about who he was willing to be." I knew she was right. I had been making a version of this argument to myself for 4 weeks. It did not make it simpler. I asked Nadia one question. "Can you make sure he doesn't know it was me who initiated this?" She was quiet for a moment. "The investigation is official at this point. He'll be able to see eventually. But the initial contact will come from Detective Reyes, not you." "That's fine," I said. "That's enough." On Friday morning, I went to work. I had a meeting at 9 and another at 11, and I ate lunch at my desk, and I answered emails, and I called a vendor about a contract renewal, and I was as ordinary as I had ever been in my life. At 2:17 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was Daniel. I watched his name on the screen for 2 full rings. Then I answered. "Hey," I said. His voice was different. The warmth was still there, but underneath it was something taut. "Hey, something's happening. Some detective called me about a financial thing, and Claire, it doesn't make sense. I think there's been some kind of mistake." "A detective?" I said. "Yeah, about some paperwork from the bank. Can I come over? I need to talk to someone." And here is where I found out something else about myself. I had expected to feel cold in that moment. I had expected the clarity I had been carrying for 4 weeks to harden into something sharp and final. Instead, what I felt was an overwhelming, exhausted sadness, not for what he had done, for what he had chosen, for the specific shape of the betrayal, which was this. He had looked at me in the worst months of my life, and he had seen an opportunity. "I'm actually not home right now," I said. "I'll call you later tonight." He said, "Okay." He said he was sure it was a misunderstanding. He said he loved me. I said I loved him too. And I ended the call, and I sat at my desk and looked at my hands for a long time. I did not call him later that night. What I did instead was drive, after work, to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. I had not been since the funeral. The evening was very still, and the light was going amber and flat across the dry grass, and the eucalyptus trees at the edge of the grounds were making a low sound in the wind. I stood at her headstone and I thought about what she had built. 40 years, property by property. A woman who drove the same truck for 15 years and brought her own lunch and did not talk about money because she understood that money was a tool, and a tool was only as good as the hands holding it. She had left it to me, not Daniel. Not split down the middle out of obligatory fairness. Me. I had spent some time being bewildered by that choice. Daniel was the one who had stayed in Arizona. Daniel was the one who had gone to her house for Sunday dinners and helped with the yard in summer. I had been the one who moved around, who had left for college and not entirely come back, who visited at the holidays and called on birthdays, but had not been, by any measure, the more present grandchild. Standing there in the evening light, I thought I was beginning to understand the choice. My grandmother was a woman who had watched people her whole life. She had run a business. She had read rooms and read contracts and read people, and she had seen something in me, or seen something in Daniel, or seen something in both of us, and she had made her decision accordingly. I thought about Daniel at my kitchen table. The oranges and the sourdough bread and the wine and the hand held across the table. All of it real, I thought, and all of it simultaneously something else. The two things did not cancel each other out. They just both existed, and I would have to carry them. I drove home. I made dinner. I slept more soundly than I had in 4 weeks. Over the following weeks, the case moved at the pace that legal cases move, which is to say, not quickly, but steadily. Daniel retained an attorney. There were conversations I was not part of, documents exchanged, negotiations conducted. Greg, in his cooperation with the investigation, had provided communication records that were, according to Nadia, thorough and damaging. The power of attorney document was definitively confirmed as fraudulent. The wire transfer attempts were documented and tied directly to the account. The challenge to my grandmother's estate was withdrawn before it was ever formally filed, because the attorney Daniel had hired looked at the evidence and told him plainly that there was no path forward. I did not see Daniel during this period. I did not block his number, but I did not answer when he called, and after 2 weeks he stopped calling. There was one text message, sent at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, that said, "I know you know. I don't know what to say except that I'm sorry." I read it 4 times. I did not respond. What I did instead was begin, slowly and with a great deal of Nadia's guidance, to take up the business my grandmother had left me. It was not something I had planned. I had thought, in the weeks before I understood what Daniel had been doing, that I would leave the management to professionals and take the inheritance as a kind of silent foundation beneath the rest of my life, a security I had not expected and did not entirely know how to hold. But Nadia introduced me to a woman named Sandra, who had worked in my grandmother's office for 11 years and who knew every property and every tenant and every contract, and who sat across from me in a conference room one morning with a folder of documents and a cup of coffee and said, with no performance or preamble, "Your grandmother thought you could do this." I thought she was right when she told me, and I still think so. I did not know what to say to that. I said, "Tell me where to start." Sandra told me where to start. My divorce from Marcus was finalized on a bright morning in March. I wore a blue dress I had bought for the occasion. Not celebratory exactly, but deliberate. I sat in the attorney's office and signed the paperwork and walked out into the Arizona sun and stood on the sidewalk and thought about the last 3 years and the particular education they had provided. Marcus had been a revelation of one kind. Daniel had been a revelation of a different kind. Both had required me to rebuild my understanding of something I had thought I knew, a marriage, a family, a version of safety I had constructed out of trust I had not fully examined. I was not angry in the way I had expected to be. I was something more like awake. I got in my car. I called Sandra and told her I had reviewed the quarterly statements from the Tucson properties and had 3 questions, and she laughed and said she had been waiting for me to call with questions, and we talked for 45 minutes on the highway heading home. The inheritance sat in a properly secured trust, managed by Mr. Holloway, growing in the slow and steady way that solid things grow. The fraudulent account had been closed and its contents fully recovered. The legal proceedings involving Daniel were ongoing and would be for some time. I did not know what would happen to my brother. I did not know if there was a version of the future in which we found some diminished, renegotiated form of what we had been. I thought probably not. I thought the particular thing he had done, the timing of it, the months of execution, the way he had held my hand, made repair very difficult. Not because I believed people could not change, but because trust is not a thing you can argue someone back into having. It either rebuilds, slowly, or it does not. I thought of my grandmother driving her truck. I thought of her bringing her own lunch. I thought of her watching for 40 years how people behaved when they thought no one was making decisions about them. I merged onto the highway and the desert opened out on both sides, flat and dry and lit in that particular afternoon, gold that made Arizona look, some days, like a place that had been waiting. I turned up the radio. I had a meeting at 9 the next morning about a property in Maricopa County that Sandra thought was a strong acquisition, and I had done my homework and I was ready. For the first time in a long time, I was ready.